In the frozen depths of Outpost Polaris, a broken sergeant was about to volunteer for certain death. What started as routine data analysis took a shocking turn when she came face to face with catastrophic sabotage that threatened humanity's last energy source. Liana Mercer wasn't your typical logistics officer. For 3 years, she had spent her life in emotional exile after losing her wife and unborn child in a diplomatic bombing, known for her methodical precision and haunting invisibility among her fellow soldiers. When she encountered the geothermal core failure and a trapped soldier's desperate radio call, she had no idea she was walking into her own resurrection. Mercer made a decision to descend into superheated hell that would lead to either heroic salvation or spectacular failure. What began as a woman with nothing left to lose would become a leader others would follow into impossible missions. The Arctic facility would never be the same after she chose to crawl through burning metal to save a stranger's life, and discovered she still had reasons to live. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning briefing started at 0600 sharp, but Sergeant Liana Mercer had been awake since 4. She stood at the reinforced observation deck of Outpost Polaris, watching the pale Arctic sun struggle against the horizon, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The base hummed with its usual pre-dawn rhythm, geothermal generators churning deep beneath the ice, communications arrays crackling with static, boots on metal grating as the night shift handed over to day crews. Liana had been stationed here for 8 months, and every morning felt the same. She was invisible. At 29, she stood barely 5'6" and moved through the corridors like a shadow. Her fellow soldiers called her Ghost behind her back, though never with malice. She was the kind of person who managed supply chains flawlessly, who knew where every piece of critical equipment was stored, who could troubleshoot a failing power grid in sub-zero conditions without breaking a sweat. But when it came to the real missions, the ones that mattered, she was always left behind. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as she slipped inside. Holographic displays covered every surface, red zones marking unstable ice formations, blue lines tracing evacuation routes. Captain Elias Monroe stood at the front, his weathered face more serious than usual as he addressed the assembled crew. Liana found a spot near the back, her tablet ready, though she already knew what was coming. Seismic activity has increased 12% over the past 72 hours, Monroe announced, his voice carrying the weight of command. The geothermal core is showing minor fluctuations, nothing critical, but we're implementing enhanced monitoring protocols. Liana's stylus hovered over her tablet. As Monroe began assigning duties, Walker to maintenance oversight, Rodriguez to communications monitoring, Thompson to equipment audit, she felt the familiar tightness in her chest. The names continued, each one a small reminder of her place in the hierarchy. Mercer, Monroe's voice cut through her thoughts. You're on data analysis. Cross-reference the seismic readings with our geological surveys. Flag any anomalies. Data analysis. Again, Liana nodded curtly, her jaw tight. Around her, the other personnel exchanged knowing glances and quiet conversations about shift rotations. She might as well have been part of the furniture. As the briefing dispersed, she caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach churn. Good thing Mercer's on death duty, Staff Sergeant Williams muttered to Rodriguez. No offense, but in a real crisis you need people who can handle the pressure. She's capable, Rodriguez replied, though his tone lacked conviction. But there's capable, and there's leadership material. Some people are built for support roles. Liana pretended not to hear, but the words burned. She'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times. Too quiet, too analytical, too disconnected from the team dynamics that supposedly mattered in life or death situations. It didn't matter that she could process tactical data faster than anyone in her unit, or that she'd quietly identified 3 separate equipment failures before they became critical issues. When it came to recognition, she was always deemed insufficient. The worst part was that she understood their reasoning. In her heart, she knew they weren't entirely wrong. Something inside her had broken 3 years ago, and she'd never quite figured out how to fix it. The spark that had once made her a brilliant strategic analyst for the Pacific Coalition had flickered out the day she lost everything that mattered. As the crew dispersed to their duties, Liana walked to the data center and pulled up the seismic monitoring interface. Hidden beneath regulation analysis protocols was a comprehensive modeling system she'd been building for months. Every night after her official duties ended, she studied geological patterns, thermodynamics, and structural integrity reports. She'd created predictive algorithms that could forecast system failures weeks in advance. Nobody had asked her to do this, nobody knew she was doing it, but Liana had learned long ago that being ready for opportunity was the only way to survive in a world that had forgotten her. The morning readings were troubling. Small fluctuations in the core's thermal output, barely registering on standard monitors, but her enhanced analysis revealed a concerning pattern. The variations weren't random. They followed a degradation curve she'd seen in theoretical models of catastrophic system failure. She pulled up historical data, cross-referencing temperature spikes with equipment maintenance logs. There, 3 weeks ago during routine maintenance, someone had accessed the core stabilization chamber. The official logs showed standard inspection procedures, but the thermal signatures suggested something else entirely. The readings were too clean, too uniform. Someone had tampered with the stabilizers. Liana stared at the screen, her pulse quickening for the first time in months. This wasn't normal wear or environmental stress. This was sabotage. Across the data center, Specialist Kato J1 hunched over his own workstation, pretending to focus on network diagnostics while secretly monitoring Liana's analysis. At 23, Kato was the youngest member of their unit, a brilliant tech specialist who'd graduated from the Tokyo Engineering Collective before the coastal floods had claimed his university. He'd been watching Liana for months, fascinated by her methodical approach to problems that others dismissed as routine. He saw her freeze at her terminal, watched her run the analysis twice, then a third time. Her face had gone pale, and her usually steady hands trembled slightly as she reached for her communications tablet. Liana composed a message to Monroe, then deleted it. She wrote it again, more carefully this time, then deleted it again. How do you tell a commanding officer that someone had sabotaged the only thing keeping their outpost, and potentially the planet's remaining geothermal stability, from complete collapse? How do you explain that you've been conducting unauthorized analysis using algorithms you developed in violation of standard protocols? More importantly, how do you convince anyone to listen when you've spent 3 years being invisible? She saved her analysis to an encrypted drive and stood up, her decision made. Whether Monroe wanted to hear it or not, she was going to tell him what she'd found. The coffee cup in her hands had long since gone cold, but her blood was finally beginning to warm. The alarms started at 1,347 hours, a low, bone-deep wail that seemed to come from the ice itself. Liana was halfway through explaining her findings to Monroe when the floor beneath them shuddered, a grinding vibration that made their teeth ache. "What the hell?" Monroe began, but his words were cut off by the screech of emergency protocols activating throughout the base. Red lights bathed the command center as personnel scrambled to their stations. The main display screen flickered to life, showing a real-time cross-section of the geothermal core. What Liana saw made her blood freeze. The primary stabilizer had failed completely. Thermal readings spiked beyond safe parameters as secondary systems struggled to compensate. Deep beneath the ice, the Earth's molten core was beginning to breach containment protocols that had held steady for 15 years. "Core destabilization in progress," announced the base's AI system, its synthetic voice maddeningly calm. "Estimated time to critical failure, 4 hours, 37 minutes. Monroe grabbed his communications headset. "All teams, report status. I need damage assessments now." The responses came in rapid succession, each one worse than the last. Maintenance Team Alpha was trapped in the lower tunnels. The secondary cooling systems were offline. Most critically, the manual override stations were located in the thermal chamber itself, a superheated cavern that had become inaccessible the moment the stabilizers failed. "Sir," came a crackling voice through the static. "This is Private Avila, thermal monitoring team. We were running diagnostics when the failure occurred. Rodriguez and Chen were evacuated, but I'm trapped in the core access chamber. The route back is blocked by debris." Liana felt her chest tighten. Noah Avila. She'd seen his file. 21 years old, conscripted from the Sao Paulo agricultural districts after the food riots. This was his first deployment, his first real assignment away from basic training facilities. "Avila, what's your status?" Monroe demanded. "Injured, sir. Left leg trapped under fallen equipment. Conscious and responsive, but I can't move without assistance. The chamber is heating up fast." Monroe turned to his senior staff, his face grim. Options? The access tunnel is compromised, reported Chief Engineer Yates. Structural integrity is failing. Any rescue attempt would be suicide. What about the thermal suits? Emergency protocols? Sir, the suits are rated for 1 hour maximum exposure. The round trip to Avila's position would take at least 3, assuming the tunnel doesn't collapse completely. And that's not accounting for extraction procedures. Monroe stared at the tactical display, calculating impossible odds. Liana watched him wrestle with the decision she knew he'd already made. In his mind, one life didn't justify risking an entire rescue team. It was cold logic, military pragmatism at its most brutal. We evacuate the base, Monroe announced finally. Full retreat to secondary positions. We cannot risk additional personnel. Sir, what about Private Avila? The question came from Cato, his young voice cutting through the command chatter. Monroe's silence was answer enough. Dr. Sana al-Khatib chose that moment to enter the command center, her severe expression made more intimidating by the emergency lighting. At 43, she was the lead geothermal engineer, technically a civilian consultant, but treated with the deference reserved for someone whose expertise kept them all alive. Captain Monroe, I need to speak with you about the core failure, she began, then stopped as she took in the evacuation preparations. You're abandoning the station? Dr. al-Khatib, the core is beyond our ability to repair. We're looking at a complete thermal breach within hours. I won't sacrifice more lives for equipment that can be rebuilt. Sana's dark eyes flashed with anger. Equipment that can be rebuilt? Captain, do you understand what happens if this geothermal system fails completely? The thermal release will destabilize ice formations across 3,000 square kilometers. The resulting seismic activity could trigger a domino effect, affecting every remaining geothermal site on the planet. Quote, We're aware of the environmental impact, Doctor, but... Are you? Sine interrupted. Because from where I stand, it looks like you're about to let a frightened boy die, while simultaneously allowing the collapse of Earth's last viable energy infrastructure. All because you don't want to risk a difficult mission. The command center fell silent except for the persistent wail of alarms. Liana felt something stir in her chest. Not anger, exactly, but a strange clarity she hadn't experienced in years. There is another option, she said quietly. Monroe turned to her, eyebrows raised. Mercer? I can reach him. Liana stepped closer to the tactical display, her finger tracing the damaged access route. The main tunnel is compromised, but there's a secondary maintenance shaft that connects to the thermal chamber. It's narrow, unstable, but passable for someone with climbing experience. That route has been sealed for 2 years, Yates objected. The structural integrity is unknown, Liana finished, but not impossible. I've been studying the base schematics. The maintenance shaft was designed as an emergency access point. It's risky, but it's not suicide. Monroe stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Mercer, even if you could reach Avila, you'd still need to repair the stabilizer manually. The thermal exposure alone would kill most people, yes. Liana's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. But I'm not most people, Captain. I don't have anything left to lose. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sana studied Liana with new interest, taking in the sergeant's calm demeanor and steady hands. There was something unsettling about her composure. Not confidence, exactly, but a kind of resigned determination that spoke of someone who'd already made peace with death. The mission parameters are suicide, Monroe said firmly. I won't authorize it. Then don't, Liana replied. I'm not asking for authorization, sir. I'm informing you of my intention. The argument lasted 23 minutes. Liana counted, watching the chronometer on the tactical display as Monroe cycled through every regulation, protocol, and chain of command argument he could summon. She listened patiently, responding when directly addressed, but her mind was already in the maintenance shaft, calculating climbing routes and equipment loads. Sergeant Mercer, I am giving you a direct order to stand down, Monroe said finally, his voice hoarse from shouting over the alarms. Understood, sir, Liana replied. Then she turned and walked toward the equipment lockers. Mercer! Monroe's voice carried the full authority of command, but Liana didn't stop. She pulled her authorization card from her jacket and placed it on the nearest console. My resignation from active duty, effective immediately, she announced without turning around. I'm now acting as a civilian volunteer. Your authority over my actions is terminated. The command center erupted in protests and arguments, but Liana tuned out the noise. She had work to do. The equipment locker contained everything she needed: thermal climbing gear, emergency medical supplies, portable tools, and most importantly, a modified communication unit that would maintain contact with base operations during the descent. She'd been stockpiling this gear for months, not because she'd planned for this specific scenario, but because being prepared had become her only remaining form of hope. That's not how military law works, Monroe was saying when she returned. You can't just resign in the middle of an operation. Actually, Captain, she can. Dr. Al-Khatib had been quietly researching protocols on her tablet. Under UN emergency response guidelines, civilian volunteers are permitted to attempt rescue operations that military personnel are forbidden from undertaking. It's specifically designed for situations like this. Monroe stared at both women, his face cycling through anger, frustration, and something that might have been respect. Dr. Al-Khatib, surely you don't support this insanity? Sana studied Liana carefully, taking in the sergeant's methodical equipment preparation and unnaturally calm demeanor. I think Sergeant Mercer is either the bravest person I've ever met or the most damaged, possibly both. I prefer the term focused, Liana said, checking the seal on her thermal suit. Dr. Al-Khatib, I'll need real-time core temperature readings and structural analysis during the descent. Can you provide remote support? You're actually serious about this. It wasn't a question. Private Avila has been trapped for 47 minutes. Core temperature is rising at approximately 8 degrees per hour. His window for survival is closing rapidly. Liana looked up from her gear. Yes, I'm serious. Sana's expression shifted from skepticism to something resembling professional interest. What's your background in thermal engineering? Limited formal training, extensive self-study. I understand the principles well enough to attempt manual stabilizer repair. Self-study. Sana's tone was dry. You're planning to fix one of the most complex geothermal systems on the planet based on self-study. Dr. Al-Khatib, Liana said patiently, in approximately 3 hours and 14 minutes, that geothermal system is going to fail regardless. My attempts can't make the situation worse. From across the command center, Cato had been quietly monitoring the exchange while running unauthorized scans of the maintenance shaft. His fingers flew across his workstation, pulling up structural blueprints and real-time sensor data. Sergeant Mercer, he called out, his voice nervous but determined. I've been analyzing the secondary access route. The shaft is partially collapsed at level 7, but there's enough clearance for passage. The main structural supports are still intact. Monroe whirled on him. Specialist J1, you're out of line. Sir, with respect, someone needs to provide accurate intelligence if this mission is going to succeed. Cato's voice strengthened as he spoke. The sensor data shows the route is dangerous, but not impossible. Sergeant Mercer has the technical skills and physical capability to attempt the rescue. And what makes you such an expert on Sergeant Mercer's capabilities? Cato glanced at Liana, then back at Monroe. I've been watching her work, sir, for months. She's been developing predictive models for system failures, creating detailed structural analyses of base infrastructure, studying thermal dynamics in her spare time. She identified the sabotage indicators weeks before the actual failure occurred. Monroe's expression shifted from anger to confusion. What sabotage indicators? Liana sighed, pulling up her encrypted analysis on a portable tablet. Someone tampered with the core stabilizers 3 weeks ago. The thermal signatures were too clean, too uniform. I tried to report it this morning, but the crisis interrupted our briefing. She showed him the data, temperature curves, equipment access logs, thermal imaging that revealed subtle but deliberate modifications to the stabilization systems. Monroe studied the information, his face growing pale as the implications became clear. You're telling me this was intentional? Yes, sir. Someone wanted the core to fail. The question is whether they intended to trigger a catastrophic breach or simply disable our geothermal capability. Quote. Sana leaned over Monroe's shoulder, examining Liana's analysis. Her eyebrows rose as she processed the data. This is remarkably sophisticated work. Where did you learn to interpret thermal dynamics at this level? Pacific Coalition Strategic Division, before my transfer to logistics. Liana's voice carried no emotion, but Cato caught the slight tightening around her eyes. I used to analyze infrastructure vulnerabilities for asymmetric warfare scenarios. Used to? Sana pressed. My clearance was revoked following psychological evaluation after the oceanic conflict. Liana finished sealing her equipment pack. Apparently, losing your family in a diplomatic bombing makes you unsuitable for strategic analysis. The command center fell silent. Even the alarm seemed to fade into background noise as the weight of Liana's words settled over the assembled personnel. Monroe studied her with new eyes, finally understanding the source of her strange calm. "Mercer," he said quietly, "you don't have to do this. There are other options." "No, Captain, there aren't." Liana shouldered her pack, the weight familiar and comforting. "Private Avila is trapped and dying. The core will breach within hours. Every minute we spend debating is a minute closer to catastrophic failure." She walked toward the access corridor, then paused at the threshold. "Dr. Al-Khatib, will you provide remote support or not?" Sanaa looked at Monroe, then back at Liana. Something in the sergeant's unwavering gaze convinced her, not confidence or hope, but an absolute clarity of purpose that demanded respect. "I'll monitor your descent and provide real-time technical guidance," Sanaa said finally. "But Liana," she paused, using the sergeant's first name for the first time, "if the situation becomes impossible, promise me you'll retreat. One death is a tragedy. 2 deaths is just waste." Liana's smile was barely visible beneath her thermal mask. "Dr. Al-Khatib, I've been dead for 3 years. Today, I'm just deciding what to do about it." She disappeared into the corridor, leaving behind a command center full of people who were finally beginning to understand what courage looked like when it had nothing left to lose. The maintenance shaft was exactly as narrow as the schematics had indicated, which was to say, barely wide enough for a human body. Liana descended slowly, her climbing harness distributing weight across reinforced anchor points that groaned ominously with each movement. The walls pressed against her shoulders, ice-slick metal that conducted the growing heat from below like a furnace chimney. "Mercer, I'm reading 43 degrees Celsius at your current position," Sanaa's voice crackled through the comm unit. "Core temperature is rising faster than projected. You need to increase your descent rate." "Acknowledged," Liana replied, though increasing speed meant accepting greater risk. The shaft's structural supports were older than the base's official documentation suggested, and several of the mounting brackets showed stress fractures that hadn't been there in the original blueprints. She rappelled down another 30 meters, past a section where the walls had buckled inward from years of thermal expansion. The space here was so narrow she had to remove her pack and push it ahead of her, inching forward on her belly through a gap that felt like being swallowed by the earth itself. The heat was becoming oppressive. Even through her thermal suit's cooling systems, sweat beaded on her forehead and ran into her eyes. The air tasted of metal and sulfur, tinged with the ozone scent that preceded electrical fires. "Liana," Sanaa's voice held new urgency. "I'm detecting thermal venting 3 levels below your position. The shaft's structural integrity is compromising faster than anticipated." "Understood. How much farther to the thermal chamber?" 47 meters vertical, then a horizontal crawl space approximately 15 meters to the access hatch. Liana paused in her descent, pressing her back against the shaft wall to rest her screaming shoulder muscles. 47 meters. In normal conditions, that would be perhaps 10 minutes of careful climbing. In these conditions, with the walls radiating heat like an oven and the air becoming too thin to breathe comfortably, it might as well be a lifetime. She closed her eyes and tried to center herself, but instead of calm, memories surfaced with vicious clarity. Anna's laugh echoing through their small apartment in Melbourne. The way she'd curl up against Liana's shoulder while reading technical reports, complaining about boring military jargon but never actually stopping. The gentle curve of her belly at 6 months, their unborn daughter moving beneath Anna's skin like a secret promise of the future. The bombing had happened during a routine diplomatic meeting. Anna was there as a civilian infrastructure consultant, supposedly safe behind layers of security protocols and international law. Liana had been analyzing tactical reports when the emergency alerts started flooding in. By the time she reached the medical center, there was nothing left to save except memories that cut like broken glass. "Liana, respond please." Sanaa's voice pulled her back to the present. "Your suit's biometrics show elevated stress indicators." "I'm fine," Liana lied, resuming her descent. The ghosts could follow her down here if they wanted. They'd been her only companions for 3 years anyway. The shaft took a sharp turn at level 12, forcing her to navigate around a support beam that had partially collapsed. Here, the walls were slick with condensation that wasn't entirely water. Steam vents had begun opening in the metal, releasing superheated vapor that fogged her helmet visor and made breathing a conscious effort. "Jesus," she muttered, wiping condensation from her faceplate. "It's like descending into hell." "From a thermodynamic perspective, that's not inaccurate," Sana replied, her dry humor providing an anchor to sanity. "The core breach is creating conditions similar to volcanic venting. You're essentially rappelling into an active geothermal event." "Sana," Liana said, surprising herself by using the doctor's first name. "If this goes wrong, if I don't make it back, tell Kato his structural analysis was perfect. He deserves to know his work mattered. Tell him yourself when you get back." "Sure," Liana agreed, though they both knew the odds were getting worse with every meter of descent. The horizontal crawl space was the worst part. Here the ceiling pressed down to barely 18 inches of clearance, forcing her to army crawl through a tunnel that felt like a coffin. The walls radiated heat that penetrated even her suit's insulation, and the air was thick with steam that turned every breath into a conscious effort. Halfway through the crawl space, her pack snagged on a protruding bolt. She was stuck, unable to move forward or backward, with superheated metal inches from her face. Panic began to claw at the edges of her consciousness, not fear of death, which had become almost abstract, but the claustrophobic terror of being trapped and helpless. "Sana, I'm stuck. Pack is caught on something. Can you free it?" Liana twisted awkwardly, trying to work the pack loose without compromising her position. The bolt had caught in the suit's emergency oxygen line, creating a tangle that seemed to tighten with every movement. Working on it, she forced her breathing to stay steady, methodical. Anna used to tease her about her methodical approach to problems. "You think like a machine, Liana. Sometimes you just have to trust intuition." But intuition had gotten Anna killed. Trusting diplomacy, believing in safety protocols, assuming that international law meant something to people with bombs and grievances. Methodology had kept Liana alive when intuition had failed everyone she loved. She unclipped the oxygen line completely, sacrificing backup air supply for mobility. The pack came free with a grinding scrape of metal on metal, and she resumed, crawling toward what she hoped was the access hatch. The crawl space ended abruptly at a circular hatch marked with radiation warnings and thermal hazard symbols. Beyond it lay the thermal chamber, and presumably Private Noah Avila. "Sana, I'm at the access point, opening the hatch now." "Liana, wait." Sana's voice carried new concern. "I'm reading massive thermal spikes in that chamber. Temperature is approaching 80 degrees Celsius. Your suit isn't rated for extended exposure at those levels." "How long do I have?" 20 minutes maximum before heat exhaustion becomes critical." "Probably less." Liana looked at the hatch wheel, then at her watch. It had taken her 47 minutes to reach this point. The return journey, carrying an injured person, would take at least twice as long. "Sana?" "Yes?" "It's been an honor working with you." Before the doctor could respond, Liana spun the hatch wheel and dropped into the thermal chamber. The heat hit her like a physical blow. Even through her suit's cooling systems, the air was thick enough to taste metallic and sharp, like breathing molten copper. The thermal chamber was larger than she'd expected, a cathedral-sized cavern carved from living rock and reinforced with industrial-grade supports that groaned under thermal stress. At the center of the chamber, the geothermal core pulsed like a beating heart. Massive stabilizer arrays surrounded it, their normal blue glow replaced by angry red warning lights. Steam vented from a dozen locations where seals had failed, creating a hellscape of superheated vapor and grinding machinery. "Avila?" Liana called out, her voice echoing strangely in the dense air. "Noah Avila, respond!" A weak voice answered from somewhere to her left. "Here, over here!" She followed the sound to equipment staging area where a support beam had collapsed, pinning a young man beneath a tangle of metal and cables. Private Noah Avila looked exactly like his personnel file photo, barely 21, with the kind of earnest face that belonged in a classroom rather than a combat zone. Blood matted his dark hair, and his left leg was trapped beneath a twisted support strut. "Sergeant?" He blinked at her through obvious pain. "Are you real?" "Real enough." Liana knelt beside him, running quick assessments of his injuries. The leg was badly trapped, but probably not broken. More concerning was the pallor of his skin and the rapid, shallow breathing that suggested shock. "How long have you been pinned?" I don't know, an hour? Maybe more? His voice carried the slight accent of rural Brazil. I kept thinking someone would come, but the radio went dead, and then it got so hot. I'm here now. Liana began examining the collapsed support structure, looking for leverage points. We're gonna get you out of here. Sergeant, I need to tell you something. Noah's hand grabbed her arm with surprising strength. The equipment failure. It wasn't an accident. I saw someone down here 3 weeks ago. Someone who shouldn't have been here. They were working on the stabilizer controls. Liana paused in her assessment. Did you recognize them? Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. No, but they were wearing maintenance coveralls with no name tags. When they saw me, they said they were running diagnostic checks. But I've been watching the maintenance schedules. There was no authorized work that day. Did you report it? Noah's face flushed with embarrassment. I was going to, but then my supervisor said to mind my own business. Said questioning senior personnel was a good way to end up on permanent latrine duty. It's okay, Liana said gently. You did fine. She returned to examining the support beam, calculating angles and stress points. The metal was too heavy to lift manually, but if she could create a fulcrum using the equipment crates nearby... Sergeant? Noah's voice was weaker now. I wrote a letter to my sister. It's in my jacket pocket. If something happens to me... Nothing's going to happen to you. Liana positioned the maintenance crate as a fulcrum point. Tell me about your sister. Maria. She's 16, wants to be a doctor. Noah's breathing was becoming more labored. Smart as hell, smarter than me anyway. I promised I'd come home and help pay for her medical training. Then we'd better make sure you keep that promise. Liana found a length of metal pipe that would serve as a lever. When I lift this beam, you need to pull yourself free. It's going to hurt, but I can only hold it for a few seconds. I understand. On 3, 1, 2, Liana threw her full weight against the improvised lever. The beam rose 6 inches, groaning against its own weight. Now! Noah screamed as he pulled his leg free, but the sound was lost in the grinding of metal as Liana lost her grip and the beam crashed back down. She immediately moved to examine his injured leg, bruised and swollen, but no obvious fractures. Can you stand? I think so. With her help, Noah struggled to his feet, testing his weight gingerly on the injured leg. It hurts, but I can walk. Good. Now we need to fix the stabilizer before this whole place comes apart. Noah stared at her as if she suggested flying to the moon. Fix it? Sergeant, we need to evacuate. The core is going critical. If we evacuate, the core breaches and takes half the Arctic Circle with it. Liana moved toward the central stabilizer array, studying the control interfaces. The manual override is right there. Someone just needs to reset the thermal regulators and restart the cooling cycle. But the heat, no one can survive long enough in that environment to complete the reset sequence. That's where you're wrong. Liana began removing her outer equipment, stripping down to the minimum gear necessary for mobility. Someone with nothing left to lose can survive quite a bit. Sergeant, you can't. Noah, she turned to face him, and something in her expression made him fall silent. I need you to do something for me. There's a letter in my personal effects, addressed to Liana Mercer. If I don't make it out of here, I need you to make sure it gets delivered. Liana Mercer? My wife! Was my wife! Liana's voice carried no emotion, but her hands shook slightly as she checked her tools. She died 3 years ago, along with our daughter. I never got to say goodbye properly. Noah stared at her, understanding dawning in his young face. Sergeant. The reset sequence takes approximately 4 minutes, Liana continued matter-of-factly. At current core temperature, I'll have maybe 6 minutes before heat exhaustion becomes critical. It's close, but doable. There has to be another way. There isn't. Liana pulled up his personnel file on her tablet, finding the letter she was looking for. Here, your letter to Maria. Want me to read it to you? Noah nodded, tears mixing with sweat on his face. Dear Maria, Liana read aloud, if you're reading this, it means something went wrong and I didn't make it home like I promised. I want you to know that every day here I thought about you and how proud I am to be your brother. You're going to be an amazing doctor. You have the heart for it, and the brains, and the stubbornness that runs in our family. She looked up at him. You want her to read this, or do you want to go home and tell her in person? I want to go home, Noah whispered. Then we fix the stabilizer, we climb out of this hell, and you write her a different letter, one that starts with "I'm coming home." The stabilizer access panel was located at the base of the core assembly, behind a maintenance hatch that required crawling through what was essentially a furnace. Liana studied the route on her tablet schematics, tracing the path through thermal venting systems and coolant lines that were now radiating heat instead of absorbing it. "Sana, I'm beginning the stabilizer reset. Noah is secure and mobile." "Liana, the core temperature has reached 91 degrees Celsius. At your current position, you're looking at ambient temperatures above 80 degrees. Your suit will fail." "How long until complete core breach?" 43 minutes. "Then I have 43 minutes to make this work." Liana stripped off her outer thermal protection, keeping only the basic suit and cooling unit. Every ounce of weight would cost precious energy in the crawl space ahead. She clipped her tools to a harness and checked her communications one final time. "Kato, are you monitoring?" "Yes, Sergeant." The young specialist's voice was tight with worry. "I've been tracking your progress. I'm also running interference with base communications. Monroe thinks you're still in the access shaft." "Good. If this goes wrong, make sure the truth gets out. Someone sabotaged the core, and they might try again if we manage to fix it." "Understood, Sergeant. For what it's worth, you're the bravest person I've ever known." "I'm not brave, Kato. I just have good insurance." Liana smiled grimly and approached the maintenance hatch. Brave people have something to lose. The crawl space was worse than anything she'd encountered during the descent. The moment she entered, the heat wrapped around her like a living thing, penetrating her suit and filling her lungs with air so hot it felt solid. The walls were slick with condensation that steamed on contact, and every surface radiated thermal energy that made her skin feel like it was cooking. She army crawled forward, following the schematic route toward the stabilizer controls. The space was barely 14 inches high, forcing her to move flat against burning metal that conducted heat through her suit like a griddle. Her cooling unit whined at maximum capacity, fighting a losing battle against ambient temperatures that exceeded its design parameters. "Liana, your suit's internal temperature is spiking," Sana reported. "You need to move faster." "Working on it." But faster meant less careful, and less careful in this environment meant death. She pushed forward, ignoring the growing heat that made every breath feel like swallowing fire. The stabilizer control panel lay behind another access hatch, this one secured with safety locks that required manual manipulation. Liana's hands shook as she worked the release mechanisms, her fine motor control degrading as heat exhaustion began to set in. Got it. The hatch swung open, revealing a control interface that looked like the bridge of a starship. Multiple screens showed system diagnostics and scrolling red text, all of it confirming what she already knew. The stabilizer was failing catastrophically. "Sana, I'm at the control panel, walking me through the reset sequence." First step, shut down primary thermal regulation. There should be a blue switch marked Core Override. Liana found the switch and flipped it. Immediately, the background hum of the facility changed pitch, becoming deeper and more ominous. Done. What's next? Cycle the coolant injection system. 3 green buttons on the right side of the panel activate them in sequence with 10-second intervals. Liana's vision was beginning to blur from the heat. Sweat ran into her eyes, stinging and making it difficult to read the control labels. She found the first green button and pressed it, then forced herself to count to 10 before pressing the second. "Coolant system cycling," she reported, "but Sana, I'm running out of time. My suit's cooling system is failing." Quote, "I know, just 2 more steps, you can do this." The third button activated with a satisfying click, and immediately the sound of rushing coolant filled the crawlspace. But instead of relief, Liana felt only growing heat as her suit's final cooling reserves depleted themselves. "Final step," Sana's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Master reset switch, red lever at the bottom of the panel, pull it down and hold for 15 seconds. Liana found the lever, her hands clumsy and unsteady. The metal was too hot to touch even through her gloves, but she grabbed it anyway, pulling with all her remaining strength. 15 seconds, she muttered, watching her chronometer through vision that swam with heat mirages. 14, 13. The heat was overwhelming now, cooking her from the inside out. Her cooling unit gave a final, tortured whine and shut down completely. 10, 9, 8. Her hands were cramping around the lever, muscles seizing in the superheated air. But she held on. counting down seconds that felt like hours. 3, 2, 1. She released the lever and immediately began crawling back toward the exit, her body moving on autopilot while her conscious mind fought waves of heat-induced delirium. The crawl space seemed endless, a burning tunnel that stretched into eternity. "Liana, respond!" Sana's voice cut through the haze. "The stabilizer is coming online. You did it. The core temperature is dropping." But Liana was beyond responding. She crawled forward on instinct alone, her world reduced to the simple imperative of moving towards slightly cooler air. Behind her, the stabilizer hummed to life, its cooling systems beginning the long process of bringing the geothermal core back to safe parameters. She emerged from the crawl space into the main chamber, where Noah waited with medical supplies and water that tasted like salvation itself. The core's angry red glow was already fading to amber, then slowly back toward its normal blue. "Is it working?" Noah asked. Liana managed a weak smile. "We'll find out when we try to climb out of here." "Sergeant," Sana's voice crackled through the comm, "I'm reading stable core temperatures for the first time in hours. You've bought us time." "How much time?" "Enough to get home, both of you." Liana looked at Noah, seeing her own exhaustion reflected in his young face. "Ready to keep that promise to your sister?" "Ready," he said firmly. "But Sergeant, next time someone needs to crawl into hell to save the world, let's find a different volunteer." "Deal," Liana agreed, and for the first time in 3 years she actually meant it. The ascent began at 1,847 hours, with core temperature stabilized at 43 degrees Celsius and falling. What should have been a moment of triumph felt more like the opening act of an entirely new nightmare. Liana stared up at the maintenance shaft that had nearly killed her on the way down, now faced with the prospect of climbing it while carrying an injured person who outweighed her by 40 pounds. "Sana, what's our window?" she asked, adjusting the makeshift harness she'd rigged to distribute Noah's weight across her climbing gear. "Core is stable, but we're detecting new seismic activity. The thermal stress has compromised several support structures throughout the facility. I'd estimate you have 2 hours before the shaft becomes completely impassable." 2 hours to cover ground that had taken her nearly 3 hours to traverse alone. The mathematics were daunting, but mathematics had never stopped her before. "Noah, we're going to do this in stages. I'll climb ahead and secure anchor points, then guide you up. Your injured leg means you'll need to rely mostly on upper body strength." Noah nodded, though she could see the fear in his eyes. At 21, he had the kind of optimism that believed in good outcomes despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. 3 years ago, Liana might have envied that naivete. Now she found it oddly comforting. "Sergeant," he said as she began rigging the climbing system, "can I ask you something personal?" "Shoot." "Your wife, Anna, what was she like?" Liana paused in her equipment check, surprised by the question. In 3 years, no one had asked her about Anna. Most people acted as if mentioning the dead was somehow contagious, as if grief might spread through casual conversation. "She was brilliant," Liana said finally. "Infrastructure engineer, specialized in sustainable water systems. She could look at a broken water treatment plant and see exactly how to make it work better than it ever had before." She smiled slightly, the expression feeling strange on her face. "She used to say I overthought everything, but she was the one who could spend 6 hours analyzing the optimal placement for a single pipeline junction." "Sounds like you two were well matched." "We were." Liana finished the harness adjustment and tested the rope tension. "She balanced out my worst instincts, made me remember that efficiency isn't the only thing that matters." The first section of the climb went smoothly. The shaft had cooled enough to be merely uncomfortable rather than actively dangerous, and Noah's injured leg didn't significantly impair his upper body strength. They made good time for the first 20 meters, with Liana setting anchors and Noah following her lead. It was at the 30-meter mark that things began to go wrong. The shaft wall shuddered as they climbed, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. Dust and ice crystals rained down from above, and one of Liana's anchor points groaned ominously under the shifting stress. "Sana, what was that?" "Seismic tremor, magnitude 3.2. The core stabilization is causing settling throughout the facility's foundation. The shaft's structural integrity is degrading faster than projected." Liana looked down at Noah, who was clinging to the rope 15 feet below her. His face was pale with exhaustion and pain, but he was holding on. Barely. "How much farther?" he called up. 40 meters to the horizontal section, then another 20 to the surface access. Liana tried to keep her voice encouraging, but the numbers were grim. At their current pace, they'd need at least 90 minutes to reach safety, assuming no further complications. Another tremor shook the shaft, stronger this time. One of the support brackets above them cracked with a sound like a gunshot, and a section of the shaft wall buckled inward. "Liana," Sana's voice carried new urgency, "you need to move faster. I'm reading structural failures throughout that section of the facility." "We're moving as fast as we can." But even as she said it, Liana could see that Noah was struggling. His breathing was labored, his movements becoming less coordinated as exhaustion and shock took their toll. "Sergeant," Noah called out, his voice strained, "maybe you should go ahead, get help, come back for me." Not happening. Liana began setting up the next anchor point, her movements quick and precise. "We go together, or not at all." "But if something happens to me, you could still." "Noah," Liana's voice cut through his protest like a blade, "I already lost my family once. I'm not losing you." The words hung in the shaft's stale air, carrying a weight that surprised them both. For 3 years, Liana had told herself that she was beyond caring, that emotional attachments were luxuries she could no longer afford, but looking down at this frightened young man who reminded her of everything she'd lost, she realized that grief hadn't made her incapable of love. It had just made her afraid to try. "Besides," she added, her tone lighter, "someone needs to make sure you write that letter to Maria, the one that starts with, 'I'm coming home.'" Noah's smile was weak but genuine. "Yes, ma'am." They resumed climbing, but the next tremor hit just as Noah was transitioning between anchor points. The shaft wall shifted, and suddenly he was swinging free, his safety line the only thing preventing a 50-meter fall to the thermal chamber. "I've got you," Liana called down, though her own anchor was groaning under the sudden additional load. "Just get your feet back against the wall." Noah struggled to regain contact with the shaft wall, his injured leg making it difficult to find purchase. Below them, the sound of grinding metal suggested that the entire structure was slowly tearing itself apart. "I can't. My leg." "Yes, you can." Liana's voice carried the authority of someone who had faced impossible situations before. "Look at me, Noah. Not down, not at the walls, just at me." He looked up, his young face tight with pain and fear. "Tell me about Maria," Liana ordered. "What's she studying?" "Pre-med," Noah replied automatically, his voice shaky but focused. "Wants to specialize in emergency medicine." Smart choice. Emergency medicine requires quick thinking under pressure, must run in the family. Noah managed to laugh despite his situation. "She always said I was a brave one, joining the military, but she's the one who stayed home to take care of our grandmother while studying for medical school entrance exams." "Sounds like bravery runs in your family in different ways." Liana was slowly working her way down toward him, redistributing the anchor loads to create a more stable climbing system. "What would Maria tell you to do right now?" "Stop panicking and use my brain instead of my emotions." "Good advice. Now, on my count, push off with your good leg and grab the safety line above you. I'll guide you to the next anchor point." The maneuver worked, though it cost them precious time and energy. Noah regained his footing, but Liana could see that he was nearing his physical limits. The injured leg was swelling badly, and his hands were beginning to shake from fatigue. Worse, the shaft was becoming increasingly unstable. Each tremor brought new cracks in the walls, new stress fractures in the support structure. What had been a dangerous but manageable climb was rapidly becoming a race against structural collapse. "Sana," Liana called into her comm unit, "how are we doing on time?" "Not good. I'm reading cascade failures throughout the facility's support structure. You have maybe 30 minutes before that shaft becomes impassable. 30 minutes to cover 30 meters of vertical climb with an injured person." The mathematics were impossible, but Liana had stopped caring about mathematics. This was about will now, about the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had kept her functional through 3 years of grief. "Change of plans," she announced to Noah. "We're going to move together from here on out. I'll set a line above us and we'll climb simultaneously. It's riskier, but it's faster." "Sergeant, if I slip—" "You won't slip, and if you do, I'll catch you." Liana's voice carried absolute certainty. "That's what family does." The word surprised them both. Family. It wasn't a term Liana had used in 3 years. It wasn't a concept she had allowed herself to consider. But looking at Noah, Exhausted, frightened, but still fighting, she realized that family wasn't just about blood or marriage certificates. Sometimes it was about choosing to refuse to let someone fall. The horizontal crawl space was a nightmare made worse by exhaustion and the growing urgency of structural collapse. What had been a tight squeeze during Liana's initial descent was now a claustrophobic tunnel, filled with debris from damaged ceiling panels and buckled support struts. She led the way, pushing aside obstacles while Noah followed behind, his breathing harsh in the confined space. "Talk to me," she ordered, partly to keep him conscious and partly to distract herself from the growing sounds of structural failure around them. "Tell me about home." "Sao Paulo Agricultural District," Noah replied, his voice muffled by the close quarters. "Fruit orchards mostly, some vegetable farming. Maria and I grew up helping our grandmother run a small medical clinic for the seasonal workers." "Is that where Maria got interested in medicine?" "Yeah. Grandmother was a retired army medic, served in the water wars back in the 30s. She taught Maria field medicine before she could properly read." Noah paused to navigate around a fallen beam, said there was no point in learning to heal if you couldn't do it under pressure. The crawl space shuddered around them, dust raining down from ceiling panels that groaned under shifted weight. Liana could hear the distant sound of metal tearing somewhere in the facility's superstructure. "Sana, how much time do we have?" she called into her comm. 15 minutes, maybe less. The main support columns are showing critical stress fractures. When they go, the entire section will collapse. 15 minutes to reach the surface. Liana calculated distances and angles, factoring in Noah's reduced mobility and the increasingly unstable route ahead. It would be close, assuming nothing else went wrong. Something else went wrong. The ceiling panel directly ahead of them buckled completely, leaving a gap barely 8 inches high. Even empty-handed, it would require wriggling through on their bellies. With equipment and an injured person, it might be impossible. "Can you make it through?" Liana asked, studying the compressed opening. Noah examined the gap, testing the stability of the surrounding structure. "Maybe. But Sergeant, if I get stuck..." "You won't get stuck." Liana was already stripping off her equipment pack, redistributing essential items to her belt and pockets. "We leave the heavy gear here, emergency supplies only." "What about your climbing equipment?" "We're almost to the surface access. If we can't make the final 20 meters without ropes, we've got bigger problems." She went through the gap first, the jagged edges of twisted metal catching at her thermal suit and leaving tears in the fabric. The space was so compressed that she had to exhale completely to fit through, moving forward on her fingertips and toes, like some kind of mechanical spider. "Your turn," she called back to Noah. "Take your time, but don't stop moving. This whole section feels like it's about to come down." Noah's progress was slower, his injured leg making it difficult to maintain the precise body positioning required for such tight quarters. Halfway through, he stopped, his breathing rapid and panicked. "I'm stuck. My leg, the swelling, I can't bend it enough to clear the obstruction." Liana could hear the edge of claustrophobic panic creeping into his voice. In the confined space, with tons of unstable metal and ice above them, panic was as dangerous as any structural collapse. "Noah, look at me." She positioned herself where he could see her face through the gap. "Remember what Maria would tell you. Use your brain, not your emotions." "My brain is telling me I'm trapped in a collapsing tunnel with no way out." "Your brain is lying to you. Fear does that. It makes impossible situations seem hopeless and manageable problems seem impossible." Liana's voice carried the calm authority of someone who had talked herself through countless desperate situations. "Now, tell me exactly where you're stuck." "Left knee. The swelling is making it catch on the ceiling panel." "Can you rotate your leg, change the angle of approach?" "I think so. Yes, that's working." Noah resumed his forward movement, slower but steady. "How do you stay so calm in situations like this?" "Practice." Liana helped pull him clear of the gap as he emerged. "And the knowledge that panic never solved anything. Fear is information. It tells you there's danger. But panic is just fear without purpose." They were in the final stretch now, a vertical shaft that led to the surface access. Unlike the maintenance shaft they'd descended earlier, this was a standard emergency exit, wider, better lit, with permanent ladder rungs instead of climbing anchors. "Almost there," Liana announced, beginning the final ascent, 20 meters to surface level. But as they climbed, the sounds of structural failure grew louder. Metal groaned and tore somewhere below them, and the ladder vibrated with tremors that seemed to originate from the facility's very foundations. "Liana!" Cinna's voice crackled with static and urgency. "Emergency evacuation alert has been sounded. All personnel are clear of the facility. You need to reach the surface in the next 5 minutes." "Copy that." Liana increased her pace, pushing herself, despite the exhaustion that made every rung feel like a mountain. Above her, she could see the outline of the surface hatch, so close it seemed like she could touch it. Below her, Noah was climbing as fast as his injured leg would allow, but she could see that he was struggling. Each rung required a conscious effort, his movements becoming less coordinated as pain and fatigue took their toll. At the 10-meter mark, disaster struck. A massive tremor shook the entire shaft, and one of the ladder's support brackets tore loose from the wall. The ladder section twisted, and suddenly Noah was hanging by his hands from a rung that was no longer properly supported. "I can't hold on," he called out, his voice tight with strain. Liana didn't hesitate. She rappelled down the ladder toward him, moving with the kind of reckless speed that would have terrified her in any other situation. "I'm coming down. Just hold on for 10 more seconds." "I can't." "Yes, you can. Think about Maria. Think about that letter you're going to write her. Think about walking into that medical clinic and seeing her face when she realizes you kept your promise." She reached him just as his grip was giving out, grabbing his wrist and taking his weight onto her own climbing harness. The sudden load nearly pulled them both loose, but Liana's anchor held. "I've got you," she said, though her own strength was nearly exhausted. "We're going to climb together. Put your arm around my shoulders." The final ascent was more controlled falling than climbing. They hauled themselves up rung by rung, Liana supporting most of Noah's weight while he provided what assistance he could with his good leg. The hatch seemed to retreat before them, always just out of reach despite their progress. But then, suddenly it was there, the surface hatch, outlined in blessed natural light that looked like salvation itself. Liana spun the release wheel and pushed the hatch open, and suddenly they were breathing real air, cold and clean and free of the metallic taste of recycled atmosphere. She hauled herself through the opening, then reached back to pull Noah up beside her. They collapsed onto the ice beside the hatch, gasping in the Arctic air that felt like luxury after hours in the heated depths below. Around them, the Outpost Polaris facility stretched across the frozen landscape, its lights twinkling like stars against the perpetual twilight of the polar winter. "We made it," Noah whispered, his voice full of wonder. "Yes," Liana agreed, and for the first time in 3 years the word carried hope instead of just acknowledgement. "We made it." In the distance, she could see emergency vehicles approaching, medical teams, rescue personnel, and presumably Captain Monroe coming to find out what the hell had happened to his missing sergeant and private. But for this moment, lying on the ice beneath the Arctic sky, Liana allowed herself to feel something she'd forgotten was possible. Pride. Not inefficiency or competence or professional achievement, but in having chosen to save someone when she could have chosen to let them fall. In having remembered that some things were worth risking everything for, even when you thought you had nothing left to risk. "Sergeant?" Noah's voice was quiet. "Thank you." "Thank you for what?" "For not leaving me behind. For giving me a chance to keep my promise to Maria." He paused, studying her face in the pale light. "For reminding me that there are people in this world worth saving." Liana looked at him, young, injured, but alive and whole and ready to go home to someone who loved him. "Noah," she said softly, "you reminded me of the same thing." The medical bay smelled of antiseptic and coffee, a combination that somehow managed to be both sterile and comforting. Liana sat on an examination table, while Dr. Martinez cleaned and bandaged the burns on her hands, each touch of the medical scanner adding another item to what was undoubtedly going to be a very long injury report. "Second-degree burns on both palms," Dr. Martinez announced to his tablet. "Minor thermal trauma to the respiratory system, severe dehydration and heat exhaustion. Recommended rest period, 72 hours minimum." "Noted," Liana replied, though they both knew she wouldn't be resting anytime soon. Through the medical bay's observation window, she could see Captain Monroe pacing in the corridor outside, flanked by 2 UN administrative officers whose crisp uniforms and serious expressions suggested that her unauthorized rescue mission had attracted attention from well above the outpost command level. "Dr. Martinez," she said as he finished with her bandages. How is Private Avila? Stable. The leg injury was less severe than it appeared. Mostly soft tissue damage and swelling. He'll be on light duty for a few weeks, but no permanent damage. The doctor paused in his work. He's been asking about you. Keeps telling anyone who'll listen that you saved his life. He saved his own life. I just provided transportation. Dr. Martinez smiled. Somehow I doubt the tribunal will see it that way. The tribunal. Liana had known it was coming from the moment she'd climbed out of that shaft. Unauthorized missions, violation of direct orders, reckless endangerment. The charges would be substantial, even if the outcome had been successful. In the military, results didn't excuse insubordination, and success didn't erase the risks that could have led to disaster. Sergeant Mercer? The voice belonged to one of the UN officers, a stern-faced woman in her 50s whose nameplate read, Administrator Chen. We're ready for you. The conference room had been configured for a formal hearing, with a panel of 3 officers seated at one end of a long table and a single chair positioned in what was unmistakably the defendant's position. Monroe sat at the panel's right, his expression carefully neutral. Administrator Chen took the center position, with another UN officer, a man Liana didn't recognize, completing the tribunal. Sergeant Liana Mercer, Administrator Chen began, reading from a tablet. You stand accused of violation of direct orders, unauthorized entry into restricted areas, reckless endangerment of personnel, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. How do you plead? Liana stood at attention, her voice clear and steady. Guilty to all charges, ma'am. The blunt admission seemed to catch the panel off guard. Monroe's eyebrows rose slightly, and the unnamed UN officer exchanged glances with Administrator Chen. Sergeant, you understand that these are serious charges? That a guilty plea could result in court-martial and dismissal from service? Yes, ma'am. I understand the implications of my actions. Then perhaps you could explain to this tribunal why you chose to violate direct orders and undertake an unauthorized rescue mission? Liana had prepared for this question during the hours she'd spent in the medical bay, but standing here now, facing the formal machinery of military justice, she found herself abandoning her carefully rehearsed explanations. Because it was the right thing to do, she said simply. Private Avila was trapped and dying. The geothermal core was heading toward catastrophic failure. Someone had to act. Someone, yes, Administrator Chen replied, but not necessarily someone who had been specifically ordered not to act. Captain Monroe, would you care to explain your reasoning for denying authorization for a rescue mission? Monroe shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The mission parameters were deemed unacceptably dangerous. Standard protocol in such situations is to evacuate all personnel and minimize casualties. Risking additional lives in what appeared to be an unwinnable scenario was not justified. Quote, and yet, the unnamed UN officer interjected, Sergeant Mercer not only successfully rescued Private Avila, but also repaired the geothermal stabilizer, preventing what could have been a catastrophic environmental disaster. How do you reconcile this outcome with your assessment of the mission's impossibility? Monroe was quiet for a long moment. I was wrong, he said finally. My assessment was based on standard operational parameters and conventional tactical thinking. I failed to account for individual initiative and unconventional approaches to problem solving. Are you saying that Sergeant Mercer's actions were justified? I'm saying that Sergeant Mercer succeeded where our conventional approach would have failed. Whether that justifies her violation of orders is for this tribunal to decide. Administrator Chen turned her attention back to Liana. Sergeant, do you have anything to say in your own defense? No, ma'am. My actions speak for themselves. I violated orders, and I would do it again under the same circumstances. The admission hung in the air like a challenge. Liana could see Monroe wince slightly at her uncompromising stance, but she was done with half measures and diplomatic language. For 3 years, she'd hidden behind regulations and protocols, using military structure as a shield against emotional engagement. Today, she was choosing to stand exposed. Ma'am, came a voice from the back of the room, request permission to address the tribunal. Everyone turned to see Dr. Sana Al-Khatib entering the conference room, her tablet in hand and her expression determined. Dr. Al-Khatib, Administrator Chen said with some surprise, this is a military disciplinary hearing. Civilian personnel don't typically. With respect, Administrator, this incident involved critical civilian infrastructure and civilian personnel. As the senior geothermal engineer responsible for this facility's operation, I have relevant testimony to provide. Monroe gestured to an empty chair. The tribunal will hear your statement, Doctor. Sana moved to the witness position with the confidence of someone accustomed to speaking with authority. I want to state for the record that Sergeant Mercer's actions were not only justified, but essential. Without her intervention, we would have lost both Private Avila and the geothermal facility. Dr. Al-Khatib, the unnamed UN officer said, "Are you saying that the facility could not have been saved through conventional means?" "I'm saying that conventional means would have failed. The manual stabilizer reset required someone to crawl through superheated access tunnels that exceeded our thermal protection equipment's rated capacity. It was a one-way mission by any reasonable assessment." "Then why did Sergeant Mercer survive, when others would not have?" Sana looked directly at Liana. "Because she wasn't trying to survive, she was trying to succeed. Sometimes that makes all the difference." The observation was more perceptive than Liana had expected. For 3 years, she'd been focused on survival, getting through each day, completing assigned tasks, maintaining functional existence. But in that burning shaft, carrying Noah toward safety, she'd remembered what it felt like to have a purpose beyond mere survival. "Furthermore," Sana continued, "I want to address the matter of competence. During her descent and repair work, Sergeant Mercer demonstrated technical knowledge and problem-solving abilities that exceeded those of most trained engineers. Her analysis of the core failure was more accurate and comprehensive than our official diagnostic reports." Administrator Chen consulted her tablet. "Dr. Al-Khatib, according to Sergeant Mercer's personnel file, she has no formal engineering training." "Correct. But she has something more valuable. The ability to see systems as integrated wholes rather than collections of separate components. She understood the geothermal facility's operation better than people who had worked on it for years." "That's quite a commendation, Doctor." "It's not a commendation, it's a recommendation." Sana's voice carried new authority. "I formally request that Sergeant Mercer be assigned to my engineering team as a specialist in emergency response and systems analysis. Her skills are being wasted in logistics." The statement created a stir around the table. Monroe looked genuinely surprised, while Administrator Chen made notes on her tablet with renewed interest. "Dr. Al-Khatib," Administrator Chen said carefully, "are you suggesting that this tribunal overlook Sergeant Mercer's disciplinary violations in favor of a promotion?" "I'm suggesting that this tribunal recognize exceptional performance under impossible circumstances. Sergeant Mercer risked everything to save lives and prevent catastrophic infrastructure failure. Punishing her for succeeding where conventional approaches would have failed sends exactly the wrong message about initiative and moral courage." Monroe cleared his throat. "If I may, Administrator Chen, I'd like to add my own recommendation to Dr. Al-Khatib's proposal." "Proceed, Captain." "Sergeant Mercer's actions have forced me to reconsider my own leadership philosophy. I've been so focused on following regulations and minimizing risks that I've forgotten the primary mission of leadership, accomplishing objectives and taking care of people." Monroe looked directly at Liana. "Sergeant Mercer accomplished both objectives when I failed to do either. Rather than disciplinary action, I recommend that she be assigned to lead our emergency response unit." Liana stared at Monroe, wondering if she'd heard correctly. "A promotion? Assignment to emergency response?" After 3 years of being invisible, the sudden attention felt surreal. "Sergeant Mercer," Administrator Chen said, "you've heard these recommendations. Do you have any response?" Liana thought about Noah, probably writing his letter home at this very moment. She thought about Anna, who had always believed that competence should be recognized regardless of conventional career paths. She thought about the last 3 years of hiding behind routine assignments and emotional numbness. "Ma'am," she said finally, "I accept responsibility for my actions and their consequences. If the tribunal believes I can serve better in an emergency response role, I'm willing to try. But I want it understood that my priority will always be mission success and personnel safety, regardless of regulations or conventional wisdom." Noted. Administrator Chen exchanged glances with her colleagues, then turned back to Liana. "This tribunal finds that while Sergeant Mercer's methods were irregular and her violation of orders unacceptable under normal circumstances, the extraordinary nature of the situation and the successful outcome justify exceptional consideration." She paused, consulting her tablet one final time. Sergeant Mercer, you are hereby reassigned to emergency response operations under Dr. Al-Khatib's technical supervision and Captain Monroe's operational command. Your security clearance is restored, and you will receive commendation for exceptional service under hazardous conditions. Liana felt something inside her chest that might have been relief or surprise or possibly hope. After 3 years of institutional invisibility, she was being recognized not just for competence, but for the kind of moral courage she thought was dead inside her. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet, Sergeant. Emergency response is dangerous work, and we have reports of similar sabotage incidents at other facilities. Your new assignment may be even more challenging than the work you've just completed. As the tribunal dispersed, Liana found herself standing alone with Sanaa and Monroe. The weight of the moment was settling over her. Not the burden of new responsibility, exactly, but the strange lightness that came from finally having work that matched her capabilities. Dr. Al-Khatib, she said, why did you recommend me? We barely know each other. Sanaa smiled, the expression transforming her serious face. Because you reminded me why I became an engineer in the first place. To fix things that are broken and protect people who need protecting. She paused. And because you called me Sanaa during the mission. People don't use first names unless they trust someone completely. Monroe stepped forward, extending his hand. Sergeant, Liana, I owe you an apology, and probably my career. If you hadn't acted when I failed to, this facility and everyone in it would be gone. Liana shook his hand, surprised by the firm grip and the genuine regret in his expression. Captain, you made the right decision based on the information you had. I just made a different decision based on information you didn't have access to. What information was that? That I had already lost everything that mattered to me. That made the risk calculation completely different. Monroe studied her carefully. And now? What's your risk calculation now? Liana thought about Noah, probably calling his sister to tell her he was coming home. She thought about Sana, who had believed in her when she'd barely believed in herself. She thought about the possibility of work that mattered, of using her skills to save rather than simply to manage. Now, she said, I have something to lose again. That makes me more careful but also more determined to make sure the risks are worth taking. Good answer, Monroe said. Emergency response work requires both qualities. As they left the conference room, Liana felt the unfamiliar sensation of looking forward to tomorrow. For 3 years, each day had been an exercise in survival, in getting through the hours without thinking too much about what she'd lost. Now suddenly she had work to do and people who counted on her competence. It wasn't the life she'd planned with Anna, and it wouldn't bring back the daughter she'd never had the chance to meet. But it was a life that had purpose again, and after 3 years of numbness, purpose felt like resurrection. Outside the medical facility, snow was beginning to fall across the Arctic landscape, each flake catching the light like a small promise of renewal. Liana pulled her jacket closer and walked toward her quarters, already planning the training protocols she'd need to develop for the emergency response unit. Behind her, the Outpost Polaris facility hummed with steady operation, its geothermal core safely contained and its personnel secure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crises that would require unconventional solutions, and the kind of moral courage that regulations couldn't teach. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Liana Mercer went to sleep believing that tomorrow was worth waking up for. The emergency alert came at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning, piercing the Arctic silence with its familiar urgency. But this time, instead of being invisible in the chaos, Liana Mercer was the person everyone looked to for answers. Mercer, we've got a situation, Captain Monroe's voice crackled through her communicator. Station Echo 7 has gone dark, geothermal core instability, possible sabotage. 43 personnel trapped. Liana was already pulling on her gear, the movement's automatic after 6 months of leading the emergency response unit. The woman who had once volunteered for suicide missions was now someone who calculated risks and led teams through impossible situations with quiet authority. Team briefing in 5 minutes, she announced over the unit's internal communications. Full emergency deployment. The emergency response team assembled with practiced efficiency. Specialist Kato Jawan looked up from his technical analysis, no longer the nervous young technician who had watched her disappear into a maintenance shaft. 6 months of working under her leadership had transformed him into a confident specialist who anticipated her needs and provided solutions before she asked for them. Sergeant, thermal signatures match our previous sabotage incident, Cato reported. Someone's systematically targeting stabilizer systems across the Arctic network. Liana studied the data with the same analytical precision that had once been dismissed as obsessive attention to detail. Now it was recognized as the foundation of her expertise, the ability to see patterns others missed and develop solutions others couldn't imagine. Same methods, different facility, she observed. Time to destination? 43 minutes by emergency transport, reported Corpsman Silva. Weather's marginal but manageable. Good, everyone clear on protocol? Liana looked around at her team. 6 specialists who had volunteered for this work because they wanted to be the ones running toward danger when everyone else ran away. This is a complex extraction with multiple trapped personnel. We do this methodically, we do it safely, and we bring everyone home. The flight to Echo 7 revealed a landscape that told the story of humanity's struggle with a hostile climate. Below them stretched endless white expanse broken by the geometric patterns of abandoned settlements, reminders of a world that had changed too fast for most people to adapt. Dr. Al-Khatib, what's our status? Liana asked through the aircraft's communication system. No contact for 96 minutes, Sanaa's voice replied. Last telemetry showed emergency protocol activation. Someone's trying to prevent catastrophic failure, but they're running out of time. Someone's still alive down there. Yes, but the thermal chamber at Echo 7 is more complex than ours. Deeper access routes, narrower passages. If you have to do manual reset, it's going to be dangerous. Liana absorbed this information calmly. 6 months of emergency response work had taught her the difference between necessary risks and reckless endangerment. She was no longer the woman who volunteered for missions because she didn't care about survival. She was someone who took calculated risks because the alternative was accepting unacceptable losses. Station Echo 7 was surrounded by emergency vehicles, their lights creating a constellation against the white landscape. Steam rose from multiple points across the facility's surface, clear indication of uncontrolled thermal venting. Commander Reyes, Liana identified herself to the evacuation coordinator, emergency response team reporting. Thank God you're here, Commander Reyes replied. 8 people trapped in thermal monitoring, all other personnel evacuated. We're looking at complete facility loss and probable casualties. Liana studied the facility schematics on her tablet, her mind automatically processing structural data and thermal patterns. The situation was familiar but complicated by different facility design and multiple trapped personnel. Primary access route is blocked by thermal damage, Cato reported. Secondary route shows integrity, but it's complex. Multiple levels, confined spaces. Round trip time 90 minutes minimum. Here's our plan, Liana announced with the authority of someone who had earned the right to make life and death decisions. Silva and Martinez establish medical staging. Cato and Chen monitor structural integrity and provide guidance during my descent. Rodriguez and Park coordinate evacuation routes. Sergeant, Commander Reyes looked concerned. Regulations specify team leaders coordinate from safe positions. Commander, regulations also specify that people shouldn't sabotage critical infrastructure, but here we are. Liana's voice carried quiet confidence. I have the most experience with manual core resets. This isn't the time for delegation. The descent took 41 minutes, following a route through damaged infrastructure and around sections where thermal venting had warped access shafts. But unlike her desperate improvisation 6 months ago, this was methodical operation supported by real-time guidance and continuous communication. Thermal readings holding steady, Sanaa's voice provided updates. Core temperature elevated but not critical. You have sufficient time for reset procedures. The thermal chamber at Echo 7 was larger but more complex than Outpost Polaris. Multiple stabilizer arrays surrounded a core that pulsed with contained energy, its blue glow fluctuating toward red as systems struggled to maintain stability. But this time, Liana wasn't alone in the depths. Her radio crackled with updates from Cato's monitoring, Silva's medical preparations, and Sanaa's technical guidance. She was part of a team now, supported by people who trusted her judgment. Beginning reset sequence, she reported. The repair work took 16 minutes, faster than before because she knew exactly what to expect. When the core's glow stabilized and emergency alarms went silent, Liana felt not desperate relief, but professional satisfaction. Core stabilized. All systems normal. Ready for personnel extraction. Quote, the evacuation went smoothly. with 8 people who had faced probable death walking out under their own power. As the last evacuee boarded transport, Commander Reyes approached with gratitude and professional respect. "Thank you, Sergeant. Without your intervention, we'd have lost 8 good people." "Just doing our job, Commander." On the return flight, Cato analyzed sabotage patterns. "Sergeant, I think we're looking at coordinated effort to destabilize the entire Arctic geothermal network." The implications were staggering. If someone was systematically targeting humanity's last reliable energy source, the consequences would extend far beyond individual facility failures. "Good work. Brief Dr. Al-Khatib and Captain Monroe when we return. If this is coordinated, we need to get ahead of it." As their aircraft approached Outpost Polaris, Liana looked out at the facility's lights against Arctic darkness. 6 months ago, she had descended into Earth's depths, believing her life was over. Today, she was returning from another successful mission with work that gave her life meaning. The grief was still there. It would always be there. Anna and their daughter would always be the family she'd lost, but grief no longer defined her. Instead of being the end of her story, it had become foundation for something new. "Sergeant," Corbin Silva spoke up, "when I requested emergency response assignment, my commander said I was crazy. Dangerous work, high casualties, no recognition." Which part was he right about? Definitely dangerous, but working with this team, doing work that matters, it's better than recognition, it's purpose. Liana nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. For 3 years, she had drifted through service like a ghost, competent but disconnected, surviving but not living. Now she was part of something larger, dedicated to standing between disaster and people who couldn't protect themselves. Her radio crackled with incoming message from Dr. Al-Khatib. "Excellent work today. Command wants to discuss expanding the program. Increased resources, permanent assignment." "Understood. We'll be ready." The aircraft touched down smoothly, and her team began routine equipment checks. But walking across the landing pad toward facility lights, Liana felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, anticipation for tomorrow. There would be other emergencies, other people trapped in impossible situations. But she wouldn't face them alone. She had a team now, work that mattered, and hard-won knowledge that even the most broken could find ways to become whole. The Arctic wind carried the scent of snow and promise of another long winter. But inside Outpost Polaris, lights were warm and systems hummed with steady operation, maintained by people who understood that civilization's survival depended on their willingness to descend into dangerous places. Liana walked toward the entrance, already planning training modifications for coordinated sabotage scenarios. For the first time in 3 years, Sergeant Liana Mercer was exactly where she belonged. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.